1971, the government produced briefing paper 1048, which showed Britain being deceitfully bundled into a federal states of Europe. It was suppressed for 30 years. This channel brings you the truth.
Welcome to the second edition of Eurocom. This week we were hoping to look more closely at the report of the Future of Europe group, but developments in Westminster have meant we're putting this report in full on our website for you to study at your leisure. Instead, the question of renegotiating Britain's relationship with the EU has again reared its head. We examine what this really means. But first, we're joined by Dr. Eric Edmonds, a former advisor to the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. He's here to answer questions put to him by Rick Timmis on the continuing crisis in the Eurozone.
Thank you, Trevor.
Hi, Rick.
Hello, Eric. What is the current situation in Greece? Will it have to leave the Eurozone?
Well, the current situation in Greece is bad. They have had 5% contraction in their GDP year on year for the last 5 years. And this is starting to bite. You've only got to switch on the TV to see the riots that are happening in Athens right at this present moment. People are really very unhappy, and the bills that are being passed for austerity in the Greek Parliament are going through with very narrow, very small majorities, 2-3 votes, and that will soon evaporate. So, frankly, Greece is going down the tube rapidly. As to whether it can stay in the Eurozone, undoubtedly the politicians will do everything they can to stay in the Eurozone. But of course, now there are stories abounding in Greece of political corruption. They recently tried to prosecute some journalists for actually publishing who was on the take on this corruption. So the political impetus and imperative to keep the Eurozone together is huge, whereas you've got the Greek people, on the other hand, suffering. So you've got two counter-opposing forces, and eventually it will be settled on the streets with blood. It's the only way it can end.
So, similarly, the situation with Spain and Italy, is it possible to bail out such large economies?
The answer is yes, you can. If you remember, I think back in 1977, the IMF bailed out us, the UK economy, and Dennis Healy famously had to turn around at London Airport and go back. But you have to follow the IMF recipe, which is massive cuts in public spending plus a devaluation of the currency. Now that is, second option is not there for Spain or Italy. So they are in a similar situation to Greece. Spain is particularly bad because of the lack of a reputable legal system in terms of property law, and they have huge debts, bad debts on banks' books. They are very worried about having the IMF in, because as soon as the IMF come in, then they look at the books and they will find a lot of very, very unpleasant things on the books of the Spanish government and the Spanish banks. You add in the fact that they're facing a secession from Catalonia and also the Basque country, and the whole thing politically is also looking very dodgy. Now, you can't separate politics and economics. Adam Smith knew that, and Oxford knows that with their PPE degrees. So the answer to your question is that I think Spain should leave the Eurozone, but of course, politically, it's imperative that they don't. Otherwise, the whole Euro project collapses.
Further to the previous two questions, can the single currency survive in any form?
Yes, it can. It could survive as a core currency for Northwest Europe. That would be Germany, Holland, Finland, Austria. Now, France would have to make a decision whether it goes with the Latin countries, Spain, Italy, Greece, or it stays with the German group. And that is a question, big political question for France. But yes, it can survive, but only in if it's reformed into that sort of group, because these countries all have roughly the same sort of productivity and labour efficiency. Once you start putting a super efficient economy like Germany, as opposed to a basket case like Spain or Italy, then of course something's got to give. They can't exist in the same grouping.
Is Britain likely then to be required to fund more bailouts and firewalls, etc.?
Yes, well, the answer to that one is Britain should not actually have to provide funds, but of course you have faced with a Europhile Prime Minister and a coalition that has a very, very strong Europhile component, in particular Mr. Clegg. So whilst formally, no, I wouldn't bet on Cameron, pressed by Clegg, agreeing to give funds. But it would have to be a voluntary agreement.
So what should we as individuals be doing to avoid the consequences?
Well, the answer to that is I wish I knew and I would go out and do it, because right now we're in a situation where the whole of the Eurozone, they're making rules up as they go along, policy is being made on the hoof, money is being printed, and in that situation, it's very difficult to predict what will happen because you just don't know what these people will do. They are desperate people. They see their whole political careers and their whole grand project collapsing, and they will do anything to preserve it. They don't care, really, about how many Greeks are starving or how many Spanish people are starving. They want to preserve their grand project, and that's it. So it's impossible to predict the answer, and if I knew, I would certainly do it.
We're hoping that Dr. Edmonds will be able to come into our studio on a regular basis in order to explain in future programmes what is happening and why in the troubled Eurozone. During the past weeks, Tory ministers William Hague, Theresa May and Michael Gove have all intimated that they are in favour of a change in the relationship Britain has with the European Union. Such a change, they say, would require a renegotiation of that relationship. Added to that has been the recent rebellion in the House of Commons when the government lost a vote on the increase in the amount of money Britain is being asked to provide to the EU budget. This was coupled with a demand from the MPs that a reduction in Britain's budget contribution be negotiated. Bearing in mind the continuous misinformation about the EU from British politicians over the past 40 years, what precisely does renegotiation mean? Is this a viable possibility, or is it just another deceitful smokescreen? Kate explains.
Renegotiation of the UK-EU relationship has been around for decades. It is a peculiarly British phenomenon arising from the self-interest and plain dishonesty with which virtually all British politicians and most British media outlets approach the awkward, for them, question of EU membership. Renegotiation is not a policy. Rather, it's a vague slogan whose purpose is to avoid any serious discussion about Europe and to continue to mislead the public. Renegotiation is, in reality, a fantasy. In short, it doesn't exist. The versions of renegotiation currently being promoted by various politicians contain the usual deceit. Some argue that the solution to the Eurozone crisis will involve a successor treaty to Lisbon, and that would be the opportunity for the UK to repatriate some powers from Brussels. This presupposes that if Brussels refused to repatriate such powers to the UK would refuse to sign the new treaty. Really? Are we being asked to believe that the UK, with its record over 4 decades of giving in to everything, would play hardball in such negotiations? Or that the UK would refuse to agree to a new treaty that is being presented as the solution to a Eurozone crisis? The very idea is laughable. The other snag is that by waiting for the rest of the EU to come up with a new treaty to negotiate over, the UK would cede control of not just the agenda of the negotiation, but the timetable as well. As everyone knows, the key to negotiating successfully is to control both the timetable and the agenda. Renegotiation hands control of these 2 key elements over to Brussels on a plate. Those that argue that renegotiation is the way forward appear to be suggesting that the rest of the EU is ready to contemplate devolving powers to member states. It is not. Has no one noticed that the Franco-German strategy for resolving the Eurozone crisis consists of giving more powers to Brussels and Frankfurt in order to bring about a real economic governance of the Eurozone? Is the fact being ignored that the new French government of François Hollande has given its wholehearted support to deeper integration into the EU? The suggestion by British politicians that the EU is ready to devolve or repatriate powers to member states is pure pie in the sky. Yet another problem is that renegotiation presupposes a body or entity which would negotiate in good faith with the British government. Does such a body or entity exist? No, it doesn't. Is there any prospect of it existing in the future? Not ever. The Commission, the Council, the European Court of Justice, the European Parliament and other bits of the central EU structure all exist to defend their own very considerable empires and certainly not to strengthen the existence of sovereign nation-states such as Britain. The reality is that renegotiation is a course of action that doesn't exist in the EU. There is no one person or body with which to negotiate. To suggest renegotiation as a possible course of action is to deliberately deceive. That is why renegotiation for the UK is a trap. If the UK is serious about reclaiming powers from Brussels, she must refuse all so-called renegotiation. The only way to get powers back is to leave the EU altogether.
Strangely, confirmation of the hopelessness of any attempt to so-called renegotiate with the EU comes from a surprising source. On the day after the rebellion in the House of Commons, the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, called a press conference during which he said the following.
But look a little closer, because a grand, unilateral repatriation of powers might sound appealing, but in reality, it is a false promise wrapped in a Union Jack. But this idea that we should or could extract ourselves from the bulk of EU obligations is nonsensical.
Finally, in an interview for a German newspaper, Janusz Lewandowski, the Polish EU Budget Commissioner, said the following.
We can't finance more Europe with substantially less money. I'm referring to Great Britain. Either they see their future in the EU in the long term, or they don't.
That is the stark choice. Either Britain relinquishes the right to govern itself from Westminster and does what it is told to do by the European Union, or it leaves. There is no halfway house of renegotiation, despite what politicians might say. This vitally significant story has only just begun. Here on Eurocom, we will keep you informed of developments as they happen, and one way or another, happen they undoubtedly will. See you soon.
Eurocon has been produced by The Unit. You can find our website at theunit.com. Our website also contains nightly filmed bulletins highlighting the most recent European Union developments affecting Britain. The next Eurocon programme will include an examination of another important area in the governance of Britain by the European Union. Remember, should anything further develop which you ought to know about, we will do our best to bring it to you without delay on this channel.